Good afternoon and welcome. We shall begin. My name is Father Andrew Downing, and I'm the Director of Ignatian Programs here at Georgetown University, one of whose responsibilities and great pleasures is to host the Dahlgren Sacred Lecture each semester. And that's what we are here for today when we're coming to hear on Magnanimity and the Magis. But before I introduce our speaker, Father Bart Geger, I wish to welcome you all to Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart. In this sacred space, generations of students, faculty, staff, and alumni have encountered God in the sacraments, in prayer, in reflection. And it is in the spirit of our Jesuit and Catholic heritage, which we are observing this month in particular, that we profess here our deep respect, our great appreciation for people of all backgrounds who enter this space seeking to grow in faith and in knowledge. So to all, I say welcome. Know that you are welcome here. As a place where faith, knowledge, and virtue are cultivated, Dahlgren Chapel is a fitting space for these sacred lectures. These programs restore and continue a practice of the early Jesuits, who, besides proclaiming the word in the sacred liturgy and exploring that word in the university classroom, sought to offer a more popular form of expounding religious topics to diverse audiences in the chapels of their colleges and universities. Neither liturgical homilies nor theoretical discourses, the Jesuits' sacred lectures were meant to edify and instruct listeners by reflecting on the ways the Christian faith is to be expressed and lived in its fullness in the contemporary world. Our speaker today, Father Bart Geger, is uniquely suited for this role, since not only does he preach as a priest and teach as a professor, but much of his scholarship focuses on the history of the early Jesuits and the ways they transmitted and constructed the spiritual legacy of their founder, St. Ignatius Loyola. Father Geger is currently a research scholar at the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies at Boston College. He's also Associate Professor of the Practice at the Close School of Theology and Ministry, also at Boston College. Previously, he was General Editor of the journal Studies in the Spirituality of Jesuits. And in 2020, he produced a new English language edition of the autobiography of St. Ignatius Loyola, which I'm sure some in this chapel, including some of the students, because they were assigned it in Father Bosco's class and in Professor Heck's class, also have read. But also then later, just recently in 2024, he completed a new English edition of the Jesuit constitutions. So with these accomplishments, with this expertise and knowledge, and with 35 years, I believe, of living as a Jesuit, I ask you to invite Father Bart Geger, to welcome him as he speaks on Magnanimity and the Magis, what St. Ignatius really said about finding God's will.
I'd like to thank Father Andy and Father Mark Bosco for inviting me to give this talk. It's a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. As a matter of fact, Father Mark and I entered the Society of Jesus the same year, 1990, in Denver, Colorado. And we are both proud natives of St. Louis, Missouri. So if you walk up to Father Bosco and ask him with a sly look how the motherland is doing, he'll know what you're talking about. This topic of discerning God's will is obviously something very near and dear to all of us. How do we know what God is asking us to do with our lives? Or to phrase it another way, how do we know that we are where God wants us to be? That God is pleased with where we are? I know for certain that all of us have those thoughts once in a while. And so, this is very relevant, and Ignatius had answers to these questions that might surprise you, and so that is what I would like to share with you today. I'd like to begin by telling a story 20 years ago I was doing my tertianship in Los Angeles. Now, tertianship is the last stage of Jesuit formation before a man makes final vows in the Jesuit order. And while I was there, I learned that a former student of mine was living in that neighborhood. And so we agreed to meet for lunch. I will call her Carrie. She was about 26 years old. And as we were sitting there in the cafe, she is telling me how she is still struggling to find out what she wants to do with her life. And I remembered that Carrie had been one of my favorite students. She was very intellectually gifted, but deeply, deeply loved her Catholic faith, deeply loved the church, and was a very, very generous person. She really wanted to work for the service of others. And so as I listened to her talk about this, I decided, you know what? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to give her the hard sell about joining religious life, something that I normally don't do. And I said to her, I said, Carrie, you know, as I listen to you talk, it strikes me that God is very likely calling you to be a sister, to join a religious community of women, and to dedicate your life to the very kind of service that you love within the very church that you love. I said, Carrie, the church desperately needs women like you. The world desperately needs women like you to step up and to give your life in that unreserved way to serving other people. And as I'm talking to her, I can see that she's really listening to what I'm saying. Her eyes kind of get that faraway look, and she kind of gets this soft smile, and she's kind of, off somewhere thinking about, imagining about being that sister. And as I'm seeing that expression on her face, I'm thinking, Bart, you are on a roll here. You are on fire. Keep going. And as I was talking, all of a sudden, she stopped smiling. And I saw her back stiffen a little bit, and her eyes narrowed suspiciously. And she said to me, wait a minute, Father Bart. How many women before me have you given this pitch to? Okay? Now I'm going to ask you to think about that for a moment. Notice what Carrie is implying. If I have given the same message, the same invitation to others, then she does not have to take it as seriously for herself. It is not a personal call from God that is directed to her unique self. Therefore, my words to her are somehow less substantial, less relevant, if I've said the same thing to others. Okay? Now, this story captures in a nutshell a profound shift that has occurred in Catholic spirituality in the last century. Most Catholics, including, I dare say, many Jesuits, are completely unaware that this shift has even happened. That is what I would like to talk about this evening, because it has profound implications for how we understand what it means to discern God's will. I suspect that many in this room, at least initially, would be inclined to sympathize with Carrie. And so what I invite you to think about is this. When we talk about a personal, direct call from God, what exactly do we mean by personal? What do we think that is supposed to look like? Now, whether they realize it or not, I would say that most Catholics today have what I would call a cell phone model of God's call in their mind. And what I mean by that is I want you to imagine that God is on a cell phone talking to you, all right? And so no one else can hear that conversation except the two of you. But there's static on the line, so you have a hard time understanding what God is saying to you directly. And so you're focusing all of your attention on trying to figure that out, what he is saying to you. Okay. But even more, because it is just God is speaking to you directly, and you are supposed to be this utterly unique individual, and God supposedly has such an utterly unique plan for you, then in no way is it possible for the rest of us to even begin to guess what God might be saying to you, because you are so unique, right? If I were your spiritual director, for example, it would be really presumptuous for me to say to you, you know what, I think God is calling you to this over here, because I would be confusing the person, that the person needs to be listening to God directly and not to be distracted or confused by what other people think, right? And notice that if we look at God's will from this perspective, what is God saying to me as a unique individual and no one else can hear it, then when we talk about discernment of God's will, what we're saying is, I have to figure out what God is thinking, right? I have to figure out what he's thinking. And by implication, if I don't get it right, I'm doomed to be unfulfilled for the rest of my life. Okay. If God has an utterly unique call directed to me, and I don't get it right, then I have missed something substantial about my Christian vocation. Okay. And I know this for a fact because I have had students in my office over and over again who tell me that they're trying to discern God's will for them, and they're terrified of making a mistake. They're terrified of making a mistake. Now, believe it or not, this way of imagining God's call is actually very recent. It has only been around for about a century, maybe a little bit more, depending on how you count it. In the ancient and medieval church, they had a very different idea of God's call. I like it to call it the megaphone model. I want you to imagine that God the Father has a megaphone, and he is speaking to the entire human race all at the same time. And he says to everyone, it is my will that all of you imitate my son Jesus the best that you can in light of your personal gifts, your limitations, and the concrete circumstances of your life. Right? So we all hear the same call. And then it's up to you to decide in a conversation with God, in prayer, what that might look like in your life. Notice that if you look at God's will from that perspective, you suddenly realize, well, wait a minute. There's 3 or 4 different things I could do for God. All of them would be great. All of them would be holy in their own way. All of them would have their challenges. And now what God has done is put the ball back in your court, so to speak. And God wants you to be thinking and reflecting on the question of, well, what am I trying to accomplish by serving God? What criterion am I going to bring to this decision? Okay. So notice in the cell phone model, the only choice that we have is to say yes or no, once we figured out what God is saying. But in that megaphone model, it suddenly opens up to a lot more creativity. And because we've all heard the same call, I can be much more proactive with you in helping you to discern your vocation. So for example, if I have a pretty good sense of your gifts and your personal weaknesses or limitations and the concrete circumstances of your life, it is entirely legitimate for me to say, you know what? I really think you should think about option A over here. And so your friends and family and the wider church suddenly become much more important in your discernment process. And Ignatius Loyola once wrote a letter to Francis Borgia, and he said, as a general rule, I hold it, that people are not the best judges of their own affairs. And what he meant was, your friends and family generally know you better than you know yourself, right? And when we try to make a vocation decision, for example, sometimes that can be really hard because we're too close to it, so to speak. We need friends and family who are able to look at it more objectively and who have only their best intentions for us in mind to give us that insight and that direction that we need. And we need them to call us to vocations that maybe we wouldn't initially choose, to stretch us, to call us to think in terms of something bigger than we would ordinarily think for ourselves, okay? So in our prayer, we're asking, for example, okay, of all these options I've got in front of me, what attracts me about each option? What frightens me about each option? And we're asking all these questions in terms of we're being very honest with God in our prayer, and we're being very honest with our friends and family, too, about our personal strengths and weaknesses and things like that. I don't see how it gets more personal than that. If you want a personal call from God, how does it get more personal, more unique than that? As I said, almost all writers on Ignatian discernment today, whether they are Jesuits or lay writers, and whether they realize it or not, presuppose the cell phone model of God's call. But there is absolutely no question that Ignatius of Loyola himself consciously believed in the megaphone model. And what that means is the way that so many of these books talk about Ignatian discernment, to put it very bluntly, misrepresent what Ignatius was trying to communicate, in some ways the very heart of his message. For example, in the Spiritual Exercises, that's his classic book, where it's basically a manual for going monk for a month, right? For the purpose of experiencing a deep, profound spiritual conversion. And Ignatius has an exercise in there called the Kingdom Meditation, or Jesuits sometimes call it the Call of the King. And Ignatius wants you to pray over this image. He says, I want you to imagine that you are a member of a kingdom with a good and holy king. And he stands up on the top of the parapet of his castle, and all the people are gathered there beneath him. And he says to them, we are under attack from enemies. I am asking anyone who will, I am asking you, I am begging you to fight by my side. And if you fight by my side in defense of this kingdom that you have loved and enjoyed your whole life, you will suffer, you will sacrifice, you will get injured. But I promise you, if you fight with me, you will also share in the glory. And Ignatius says, if you would get turned on at the idea of a human king saying that to you, a human king who is finite and sinful like the rest of us, how much more enthusiastic would we be if it's Christ the King, the perfect King, whose cause could not be more just and holy, who gives us that same message? And imagine you're sitting there listening to the king utter this proclamation. Ignatius asks you to reflect on how would you respond to that? Because it's not simply a matter of saying yes or no to the king. It's also a question of how profoundly, how deeply do I want to respond? So for example, in the Spiritual Exercises, Ignatius writes, we gaze upon Christ our Lord, the eternal King, and all the world assembled before him. He calls to them all, and to each person in particular he says, isn't that interesting? He calls to them all, he gives them the same message, but Ignatius also says it goes to each particular person. My will is to conquer the whole world and all my enemies, and thus to enter into the glory of my Father. Therefore, whoever wishes to come with me must labor with me, so that through following me in the pain, he or she may follow me also in the glory. And what Ignatius says is, there's basically 4 ways that we can respond to that call. One way is simply to ignore it and to go home. But Ignatius also says, I will consider what good subjects ought to respond to a king so generous and kind, and how consequently, if someone did not answer his call, he would be scorned and upbraided by everyone and accounted as an unworthy, ungrateful knight. So Ignatius is saying there are some people who respond to the king, but they're going to do it out of fear that if they don't, they're going to get looked down upon. But then Ignatius also says, I will reflect that all those who have judgment and reason will offer themselves wholeheartedly for this labor. In other words, there are others who, looking at it rationally, are going to say, this king has given me everything I've ever had and ever will. I owe it to him. Reason dictates that if this kingdom is going to survive, men and women have to step up and fight for this king. And so there will be people who respond out of that sense of duty, and they're going to tend to be a little bit more generous and a little bit more broad-minded in that response to the king. And then Ignatius says, those who desire to show greater devotion and to distinguish themselves in total service to their eternal King and universal Lord will go further still. They will ask, provided it is for the Lord's greater glory and honor. That's a key phrase we'll come back to in a minute. Provided that it's for the King's greater glory and honor, we are asking to experience sufferings and deprivations precisely out of love for the Lord. Lord, if you had to do this, then I want to experience it too, so that I understand you better. And I am asking for the grace, if it is for your greater glory and honor, to suffer for the sake of serving you, maybe so that someone else doesn't have to. Okay? So fear, duty, love. This is a very traditional idea that goes back to the church fathers. Ignatius did not invent this. All right, this is very traditional. What Ignatius is basically saying is that as Christians, we are called not simply to say yes or no to the Lord. If we say yes, we have to further reflect on what that yes is going to look like in our lives and how profoundly we want to respond to that call. Right? Now, what criterion did Ignatius want us to use when making that decision? Okay, I've got option A, B, C, and D in front of me. It takes the pressure off now, because now it's not a question of, am I going to get this right or not? You know that you could serve God very well in any of those options, okay? So that takes the pressure off right there. But what criterion do you use to make that decision? What does it mean to follow God more deeply? Ignatius had an answer to this question, which was specifically Ignatian. This is not necessarily something that every saint or religious order is going to say, right? You've all heard the phrase, for the greater glory of God, right? That is not simply a rhetorical expression meant to get people excited, something like go and set the world on fire. Ignatius meant something very, very specific and concrete by this. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. But what Ignatius said is, if you want to think like me, if you want to ask what magnanimity looks like, magnanimity means a big heart, a big soul in the service of God. For Ignatius, he says, look, if it is the essential vocation of every human being to bring not only themselves, but other people into heaven, that's the essential vocation for all of us. To get not only ourselves, but other people into heaven, then doesn't it stand to reason that the most important thing we could ever do in our lives is to try to bring as many people home to God as possible? In every decision that we make, not just vocation decisions, but all the decisions that we make, what if we had that in the back of our minds? Which of these options, at least in theory, at least in principle, would seem to glorify God more. And that word glorify means to draw good attention to God. In other words, get more people to notice God and rejoice in his truth, his goodness, and his beauty. That is what Ignatius meant by having a magnanimous heart. Now, to be clear, Ignatius is not saying that's a moral duty or that's something that you have to do. He was very clear on that. Early Jesuits were very clear on this. They said that this is what you might call praiseworthy but not obligatory. If we make all of our decisions on that basis, and Ignatius called that pure intention, when we try to make every decision on the basis of what is going to make that bigger impact on God's people. To use a simple example, you have all heard the expression, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Right? Now, obviously, both actions are good and holy. All right? And obviously, someone needs to do both. You can't teach the man if he's hungry in the meantime. So feeding him has to come first. But Ignatius is going to say, like he would say to Jesuits, because he wants Jesuits to be making all of their decisions too, on the basis of what's going to serve that greater glory of God. He made that very clear. What he would say to Jesuits is, if there's somebody else there who can feed him, I want you to focus on teaching him how to fish. Because if you teach him how to fish, you're going to empower him as a husband and father, because now he no longer has to rely on charity. That frees you up to go somewhere else and teach someone else, and that frees him up to go back home and teach everyone else in the village how to fish. So both actions are good and holy, but all else being equal, you're going to get a much bigger bang for your buck if you teach the man how to fish. And that right there is why Jesuits are in education. That right there is why Ignatius embraced schools so enthusiastically. To make it more personal, imagine someone who is the son and grandson of bartenders. Bartending goes back in the family a long way. They got a long tradition of it. And so the question arises, does he want to take up that same profession? But then someone else says to him, you know what? You've got the real skills and gifts to be a religion teacher, a grade school religion teacher. Why don't you think about doing that? Okay. Now, at the rational level, all else being equal, you could probably save a few souls as a bartender, okay? But I think you'll agree with me that all else being equal, unless there's some extenuating circumstances, you're gonna get a bigger bang for your buck if you teach religion to grade school kids, because A, you're teaching a much larger group of people, B, you're doing it every day, and C, you are speaking explicitly about the things of God in a way that you probably can't do if you're a bartender, okay? And so what Ignatius is going to say is that even if you have personal desires, like a personal inclination to want to keep that family tradition going, which would be perfectly understandable, and of course, it goes without saying, it would not be a sin to choose to be a bartender. Okay. Ignatius is going to say, if reason tells you that you're going to make that bigger bang as a teacher, then you really need to think about being that teacher. And that is what Ignatius meant by indifference, that, okay, my personal desires might be over here, but if I see this over here is going to serve God's greater glory, do I have the freedom to embrace that? Okay? That's a message that I don't think we hear very often today. It's very countercultural. And I'm not saying it is not without its own challenges, but that is what I am asking us to think about a little bit today. Okay? One thing that Ignatius presupposed and he was very explicit about this in his letters, he presupposes an old idea that goes all the way back to the church fathers. And that is that happiness is a choice that we make. We choose to be happy people, choose to be happy. Okay. The idea that I can't be happy unless I'm married and have kids, or unless I'm a priest, or unless I live over there, or unless I have this particular job over here. Our Catholic tradition literally called that a heresy. They called it a heresy of the place. I can't be happy unless I leave here and go over there. Okay? And modern psychology is actually backing this up. That happy people, we're not talking about people who obviously have clinical depression and things like that. That's a different story. But as a general rule, we choose to be happy. And if we accept that idea, it has profound implications for how we understand discernment of God's will, because we'll stop thinking in terms of what's going to make me happy, what's going to make me fulfilled. We stop thinking about it therapeutically, what's going to make me a better me, and we start thinking more objectively about God's glory. Okay. To give you some examples of this is what made the early Jesuits so controversial, because Ignatius was very, very consistent about this idea. You might even say ruthlessly consistent, which is why he upset a lot of people. So, for example, I think it was 1547, there was a Catholic parish in the north of Italy whose pastor died. And he had really been a pastor in name only. He was kind of an absentee pastor. And they had not really had a good pastor for a long time. And so they wrote a letter to Ignatius. And they said, Father Ignatius, can you loan us a Jesuit for a few months until we find a pastor? And so Ignatius sent them a Jesuit named Father Andrea Galvanello. Well, Father Galvanello was just a rock star. I mean, he was an amazing preacher and an amazing pastoral man. And the people just fell in love with him. And so you can guess what happened. They wrote letters to Ignatius saying, well, forget about our search. We want to keep Father Galvanello. And Ignatius wrote back and said, I'm very gratified that you like Father Galvanello and that he's made such a difference in your parish. But I think he's going to serve God's greater glory. He's going to make a bigger impact on the church if he moves around from parish to parish and does the same thing, what we would call parish revitalization. Okay. Well, the people were pretty upset at that. And they wrote letters back to Ignatius. Oh, they called him all kinds of names. They called him callous. They called him a hypocrite. And they said, we thought you were all about the saving of souls. And he wrote back, and they even played hardball. One person wrote a letter to Ignatius and said, if you don't let us keep this guy, we'll all leave the church and become Protestant. Okay? They did not fool around. And they even wrote letters to the Pope, trying to get the Pope to arm twist Ignatius into letting them keep this guy. And Ignatius wrote back, and he basically said, I understand why you're upset. I really, really do get it. I'm asking you to understand that good Christians and good conscience can answer this question differently. I and my Jesuits are trying to make the widest impact we can on God's people. And so if someone else wanted to let you keep Father, that might make perfect sense. But we Jesuits, that's not what we're trying to do, okay? And so he bit the bullet, Ignatius did, and sent Father Galvanello somewhere else, okay? That's what I mean when I said Ignatius is very, very consistent in how he makes these decisions. One little area where this plays out for us today is that you know from personal experience, most of you, I'm sure, good and generous people, it is so easy to burn out because people keep asking you to do things, right? For Ignatius, self-care was a huge part of his spirituality because he told Jesuits, if you're going to do the biggest impact that you can on God's people over the course of, God willing, 80 years or more, you're no good to me if you burn yourself out in a brief blaze of pious glory, okay? And so he told Jesuits, I want you to get enough sleep each night. I don't want you doing all this heavy asceticism. I want you to eat three meals a day when you can. I want you to take a vacation and a retreat every year if you can. Because it's not about you, your personal holiness and ascetical mortification coming to God. I need you out there working for other people, right? And what that meant was, if you take that seriously, you will very often have to say no to good people who ask for your help. Because if you say yes to everyone, you're going to burn out. And the temptation is to think that you're a bad person, a bad Christian, if you say no. And Ignatius would respond, no, it's precisely because you love God and his people that you have to tell good people no once in a while. And that's why Ignatius wrote in the Jesuit constitutions that one of the most important virtues that any superior general needs, the big cheese of the Jesuits, is, he didn't put it like this, but what he said was, he has to be willing to take a lot of flack from good people who don't understand the decisions that he's made. Okay. Here's another example. In 1547, the King of Portugal loved Jesuits, the early Jesuits. He just thought we were the bee's knees. And he asked an early Jesuit named Diego Marón to hear his confessions. Now, in those days, if you were a Catholic priest and you heard the confessions of a king or queen, that was a very prestigious role because it meant the monarch was trusting you to keep your mouth shut about serious matters of state, and the monarch was also trusting you to give him or her some good advice, right? And so King John asked Father Marón to be his confessor. Marón told him no, and he wrote a letter to a Father Ignatius in Rome, and he says, Father Ignatius, you'll be so proud of me. The king asked me to be his confessor. I said no, because I was afraid if I took the job, it would make me proud and vain. And I was afraid that people would talk and say that I was gossip, that I was jockeying for this job. Ignatius wrote a letter back and effectively said, you Nimrod, take the job, okay? Because it's not about you. He says, if you form King John into a good and holy Catholic monarch, that is going to have tremendous payoff for everyone in the kingdom. Don't think simply in terms of your own sanctification, what makes you fulfilled. Think about the bigger picture. And so Marón took the job, and King John loved Father Marón hearing his confessions. And he writes letters to all the other Catholic monarchs, and he says, you guys got to get yourself a Jesuit confessor, all right? And now Father McCoog can speak to this better than I can, but I think something like by the time 40 or 50 years had passed, Jesuits were hearing the confessions of most of the Catholic monarchs in Europe. Now you're a Protestant, or you're a Catholic who doesn't like Jesuits, and you see this. What are you thinking? Conspiracy. There was literally a fear that all these Jesuit confessors were gathering in Rome with Father General, and that they were dictating the course of European politics through the confessional. So the Father General would say, okay, you tell the Queen of France that unless she wages war against Belgium, you're not going to forgive her sins, or something like that. Okay. And you know that this conspiracy theory was so prominent that it was actually listed when the Society of Jesus was suppressed in 1773. That is one of the reasons that was listed. And that conspiracy theory lasted well until the 20th century. My point being that Ignatius, certainly he wanted us working with the poor. Absolutely. From the very beginning, Ignatius himself and the first companions worked with the poor. But Ignatius was also very clear. He wanted Jesuits working with society's elites. Because you have to remember, in those days, the vast majority of Europeans are illiterate, the great majority. And so there was no social mobility. I mean, if you were born an illiterate commoner, there was no social climbing at all. And so in order to effect the greatest good for the masses, you have to really form the elites, the movers and shakers of society. And Ignatius understood that. And that's why Jesuits, from the very beginning, had a reputation for being elitist, for hobnobbing with the movers and shakers of society. It goes to show how Ignatius' spirituality has real implications that can be perceived anyway as being controversial. Okay? Now, I want to summarize it in this way. I tell my students, no, let me phrase it like this. I used to prepare couples for marriage back when I was at Regis University in Denver, engaged couples. I would meet with them 2 or 3 times to talk about, what it means to be a married couple in the church and the theology of marriage. And on the first day of meeting them, I would ask them, why are you getting married? And they would look at me like I was crazy. And they would say, well, Father, of course, because we love each other. And I said, no, you don't get off that easy, all right? You can love each other your whole lives and never get married. There are many, many people who do it. What are you trying to accomplish by being married that you cannot accomplish by remaining single? What are you trying to accomplish for God and His church and for your family? What kind of witness are you trying to be? Because when the day comes that those feelings of romance wear off, and they will, you'll have that to hold on to. If you have a deep sense of meaning, then whether you're going through good times, dry times, bad times, you will always have that to hold on to, okay? Don't judge your marriage by the emotional highs and lows, but rather by your commitment to this holy vocation and what you are trying to accomplish, okay? I asked once when I was teaching at St. Louis U High, there was a married man with 2 teenage boys, and his name was Matt Shudo. And I was just being goofy one day, and I said, hey, Matt, what's it like being married? And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, I had more fun when I was single, but I'm happier now. And I thought, the force is strong with you, young Skywalker, okay? This is exactly what Ignatius said to Jesuits. There was a Jesuit by the name of Father Godinho. Ignatius assigned him to be the bookkeeper for a Jesuit high school in Portugal. And this Jesuit, so he's sitting behind a desk all day pushing a pencil, and he writes a letter to Ignatius, and he says, Father Ignatius, I'm asking you for a transfer because I just don't have a lot of emotional gratification in this work that I'm doing. Can you send me to a mission where I have some more perks in that regard? And of course, the great irony is he's writing to Ignatius, who spends the last 16 years of his life behind a desk, right? And Ignatius wrote back to him and said, I understand that the work you're doing is dry, but you need to remember that that school would not exist without you doing what you're doing. That school is making a tremendous impact on the lives of these boys. And yes, the teachers in the classroom are going to get more emotional gratification out of it. That's true. But what Ignatius said to the Father Godinho is, what you're doing is actually holier. You're doing it precisely because you know that you are serving the greater glory of God. You're making that bigger impact on his people in light of your gifts and your limitations. And he says, hold on to that. Let that be your sense of meaning, your purpose, your pure intention, your magnanimity. And Ignatius says, he says this, that's how you know that you're a good Jesuit. When you're dedicated to serving that greater glory and doing what your superiors ask you, right? Let that be your consolation. And so I just like to tell my students, I say, there are days I wake up in the morning and I feel like the luckiest man on earth to be a priest. I bounce out of bed and I can't wait to do what I do. There are other days I get up and the only reason I say Mass is because someone's going to yell at me if I don't, okay? God seems a million miles away. I am not feeling it at all. But even on my dry days, I know that what I do matters to people. By celebrating the sacraments, by preaching, by working with people, I am helping to bring them closer to God. And I hold on to that. That's what Ignatius called devotion. And what that means is, my bad days are never really that bad. And the good days are absolutely out of this world. Thank you very much.